Chapter 23, Part 2, continued. Mr. Patterson. One summer, around 1975 or 76, Curtis wasn't seen on the stall for a few days. Ernie was there and was his usual chatty self, but something didn't seem right. He started shutting up the shop early or asking us to cover. He even turned down jobs. He confided in me one evening that Curtis was in hospital suffering from chest pains. He was only 52 years old, but it turned out he had a weak heart. We didn't find out much more than that. Curtis died suddenly one night in the August. Must have been 1976. Ernie had been by his bedside along with his close family, and it all seemed to happen so quickly, so suddenly, so unexpectedly. Well, news filtered back onto the streets. The manor was devastated. In all my time in the East End, I have never seen such an outpouring of grief for one man. We all knew he was popular, but we never knew just how many lives he touched. To see the recent race riots in London makes me so bloody angry. There's no need. Ignorance is what it is. Curtis was a black man in a predominantly white community. It was his personality that mattered. He wasn't Black Curtis. He was funny, witty, silly, clever, cheeky Curtis. He won people over with his personality. He didn't have to be anything else. I'm still convinced there are enough good people out there, you know, even with everything we see on the television or read about in the papers. The media doesn't help. It was never the same after we lost Curtis. Ernie was never the same. I asked him to elaborate on that. Well, the market was stunned, he said. No one could quite get their heads around it. We rallied and we supported each other. We reached out for each other, but we couldn't get our heads around it. How could somebody so good be taken from us? I think we all realised how much we meant to each other after that. It took a death for us to appreciate life. Well, the market carried on. Life does, doesn't it? It has to. After a few weeks, to the outsider, things must have seemed normal. The market was busy, the flowers for Curtis around the stalls died, and we cleared away. Life and trade continued. People had been ill before, people had died before, but nobody had left a hole as big as Curtis. People were so busy grieving that they didn't notice the effect it had on his best friend, Ernie. And for understandable reasons, he wasn't expected to be his usual self, and people gave him space. And yet, as the days and weeks went by, people got lost in their own little worlds. You do, don't you? Ernie never really did show how he was truly feeling. Yes, he cried. Yes, he was quiet, but we all were. Nobody judged him, but nobody really stopped to think about him either. He never asked for help, but we should have been more aware. We should have done more to help and support him. There was a real sadness in his voice at this point. He was struggling to talk, so I just let him continue at his own pace. He went on. It was in January, just after the New Year to welcome in 1977, and I remember opening up one morning to find no sign of Ernie. Blooming Marvellous stayed closed that day, that week. Dad waited for a few days before going round to his flat. No answer. Nothing on the market remains a secret for long, and suddenly everyone was worried about Ernie. We realised as a collective that things weren't right. He hadn't been seen in the pubs, he hadn't turned up for get-togethers or nights out, and some of the lads even forced their way into his flat, but he wasn't there. The place was all in order, neat and tidy and nothing missing, but he'd gone. No note. We didn't have anything to go on. He hadn't left any message or clue to say he was in trouble. The police wouldn't have cared. An adult off the radar for a week or so was hardly an emergency. But we knew something wasn't right. Where was he? I asked, jumping the gun. We didn't know. The stall remained closed, the flat remained empty, and yet the landlord of his flat and the market stall were still getting paid. Wherever he was, whatever he was doing, money was still being sent to cover the bills. Life goes on, as they say, and we continued to trade. The stall next door remained closed. Months went by. We were doing so well that we expanded to use the space next door to stock our displays and carpets and rugs. I'm sure Ernie wouldn't have minded. Then one day, totally out the blue, Dad spotted a familiar figure walking towards us. It was Ernie. Oh, we ran to greet him like the lost relative and embraced him. I remember him smiling back at us and returning our hugs, but he wasn't himself. We asked if he was back, if he was ready to start again. We made small talk and jostled and joked, but he wasn't the same. Had I known then what I know now, I would have realised he was going through some sort of breakdown. Outwardly, he was doing his best not to show it, but inside, the man was suffering. I asked Mr. Patterson, "Did you find out where he'd been for the last few months?" He went on. "From what I remember, he'd left to go to Cumbria. He mentioned he had an old friend there. He did tell my mother in a separate conversation that he couldn't cope any more, but he asked her not to tell anyone, and she promised she wouldn't. She only mentioned it many years later after he'd gone, and even then I think she felt guilty betraying her confidence. I remember having a drink with him a few weeks after he returned. He still showed glimpses of his old self, but he had demons inside he couldn't exercise. Guilt was consuming him. He had to offload, and he chose to speak to me. He did not know how to cope with the death of Curtis. He did mention another close friend he'd lost in America, but he didn't go into any more detail. He said that he'd gone back up to Cumbria to visit old friends. He kept saying he couldn't go home, but he wanted to see his family. It just didn't make sense to me. We had both had a few drinks. I might have been confused. He said he had stayed with friends in Carlisle. I can't remember who they were or even if he told me their names. He said he wanted to find and see his parents. He wanted to know that they were okay. Perhaps when Curtis died, he realised he needed his family. I don't recall him mentioning his family or where he was originally from in all that time I knew him. That night in the pub, he confided in me. On that visit, he found out through his friends that his parents had died. Nothing sinister, old age, I think, but he took it badly. I don't think he'd seen them for years. I don't know why he hadn't seen them. I suppose I put it down to travelling about and working away. But more loss and grief for him to deal with, and maybe some regret. Two best friends and parents. He returned to London a shadow of his former self. He was never rude or discourteous, but he stopped visiting us, and others. The stall was given to the Jackson family, and slowly but surely it died too. They didn't have the same drive or desire, and certainly not the personality of either Curtis or Ernie. That kind of business just wasn't for everyone. "What happened to Ernie?" I asked. "Well, he stayed in the area for a while. He just kept himself to himself. We saw him around occasionally to say hello to, but that was about it. It didn't happen overnight. You get caught up in your own little world, like I said. As the days go by, you just accept it. People are selfish, really. We get consumed by what we consider to be important, when, really, most of it was just nonsense. Ernie was always polite. He was always happy. Well, outwardly anyway. It wasn't talked about then, but I think he was suffering from depression or some kind of mental breakdown. His public face was a show. He wouldn't have been to see a doctor. He just didn't back then. He moved to another flat in Surrey Quays soon after. It must have been around 1979, winter time. I'm sure my brother helped him move his stuff. He started a job over there. I don't remember what it was. We were all so sorry to hear the news that he was leaving. It felt like the end of an era. It's troubled me a lot over the years. I should have done more to help him. I hope he's all right, whatever he's doing. Depression's a terrible thing. My own mother suffered from it towards her end. She couldn't explain it. She couldn't explain why she'd be down one minute and okay the next. She just seemed to give up in the end. I hope Ernie didn't. I do really regret not being there for him, but I just didn't know what to do. I didn't understand. Well, I can't help you much more than that, Mr. Brunskill. If you manage to find out what happened to him, I'd be obliged if you'd let me know. I'm an old man, and I should be over this kind of thing. I've seen enough people come and go over the years. Death and loss become part of life at my age, as sad as it is. I don't have many regrets in life, but one would be that I didn't do enough for a man that did so much for everyone else. He seemed to save everyone. He cheered everyone up, him and Curtis. But who was there to save them? We're a selfish race, aren't we? While I still had him on the phone, I pleaded for any link, any lead that might help me find Ernie beyond 1979. I can't really help you with that, Mr. Brunskill. The only thing that was big down there around Surrey Quays was talk of regeneration of the Docklands. The place had remained derelict since the late 60s, and the government was starting to throw money at it. It was an embarrassment for the city, a dangerous place. I would imagine there are plenty of labouring jobs going on at the time. Maybe he got in there. Who knows? It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start, and I promised Mr. Patterson I would let him know if I found anything more. The Ernie Grimshaw of 1979 was not the man I was now accustomed to hearing about. Life had got to him. He was afraid and vulnerable. He wasn't indestructible. And suddenly I felt a surge of sympathy towards him. He was such a strong and resilient character, a life and soul, the backbone, the support and help, the friend. But who did he have to help him? He had lost his parents and his two best friends. He had given up his life for others. Who was there for him when he needed help? I looked at the tube map for Surrey Quays. It was easy enough to get to. I'll go in the morning. Why? Well, I don't know yet. Something might crop up. I'll keep reading the Facebook group and see if anyone else has anything to add. Perhaps the Jackson family are still in that area. That'd be like trying to find a needle in a haystack after all these years. The area's changed so much. I doubt many of the residents now have been there since the 70s. After the call, I made myself a coffee and sat back on the bed thinking. I had a gap to fill now, between 1979 and 2017, and I owed it to Ernie, never mind Mr. Green.